My students, in this video, I'm going to talk about the challenges that the United States faced in the late 18th century after the ratification of the Constitution. So we're looking at the 1790s. First, we see the way in which the economy of the United States is constructed and developed by Alexander Hamilton. Remember that in the 1780s, under the Articles of Confederation, the United States was really struggling to pay its bills and be economically viable. Hamilton is very much influenced by a book called The Wealth of Nations that had been published in 1776 by a man named Adam Smith. And The Wealth of Nations laid out the economic system that would come to be known as capitalism, as an alternative to one of the dominant economic systems at the time that was protectionism. And The Wealth of Nations argued that the more freedom that you give individual companies to trade with whoever they like, the more revenue that will bring in to the country that they are from, the wealthier people will become. And this was the approach that Hamilton took to guiding the United States economy. And so he's going to take a capitalist approach. He's going to envision the United States as the world's leading capitalist nation. But he's also going to be successful in imposing taxes on Americans that Americans are willing to pay, that enables the government to fund itself and to pay its debt, to developing government bonds that also help the government to remain financially solvent, and imposing tariffs on foreign produced goods. And this enables American producers to sell their goods at higher prices and is designed to protect and support them. And so these are the ways in which Hamilton establishes the United States economy. The one measure that he carried out that caused him the most difficulty was the measure of a national bank, creating a national bank. For Hamilton, creating a national bank meant that you could loan out money, increase the money supply that was available above and beyond the gold and silver that a country had to hand. That in this way, a national bank could finance a reliable source of debt. Now, some people agreed with Hamilton on this. The Federalists agreed with Hamilton on this. The Republicans, like Jefferson and Madison, were highly suspicious of this. They saw no authority for the government to create a national bank in the Constitution, so they felt that it was a mistake in that sense. And they also felt that this would lead to an all-powerful national bank that was controlling the finances of the states. In the end, George Washington, the president, who is seen as the unifying figure between these two factions, Federalists and the Republicans, decides to go with the national bank and establish a national bank. But this is also a win for the Federalist approach to interpreting the Constitution. That something like a national bank that's not included in the Constitution can nevertheless be developed out of the Constitution, can be seen by people as a consistent development with the principles of the Constitution. So that's part of why it's so interesting. So that's the economic aspects of the United States in the 1790s. We also want to talk about the expansion of the United States. And so, first of all, we see this in foreign policy. There's a real challenge to regularize relations with Britain. John Jay, who was a leading Federalist at the time of the ratification, who becomes the first Chief Justice at the Supreme Court, is sent to Britain to negotiate a better treaty with Britain. And to negotiate a way for Americans to trade with British ports, because remember, this embargo had been placed on Americans to punish them after the War of Independence. And Jay is able to secure what becomes known as the Jay Treaty. It's seen as an act of weakness by many Americans, because Jay compromises on a lot of aspects of American sovereignty that Americans wanted guaranteed. But he does bring trade to American merchants, he brings peace to relations between America and Britain, and this is seen as a vital win for the country as a whole. Even though the Americans can't be totally independent, can't totally negotiate with Britain on an equal footing, they have nevertheless managed to negotiate trade that is crucial to their economy and to their economic independence. And it kind of reflects where they are at the time, that they're on the way to negotiating with Britain as an equal, but they're not quite there yet. The other important foreign policy initiative that we see in the 1790s is the establishment of a peace treaty with Spain. This was very important because Spain controlled New Orleans, which controlled the mouth of the Mississippi, and initially closed the Mississippi to American shipping. This was really damaging to American farmers in the emerging states of Tennessee and Kentucky and in the Ohio Territory, who needed to be able to trade down the Mississippi to make a profit. And so in the end, in the 1790s, another leading American diplomat, Charles Pinckney, is able to establish a treaty that secures trade, that Americans can trade through the Mississippi. That they can, the Mississippi is no longer closed to them shipping their products to New Orleans to trade or shipping their products along the Mississippi to exit the continent and trade in the Caribbean. So this is really important. This encourages further settlement of the territory that's west of the Appalachians, what will become Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. And this leads to another foreign policy treaty, the Greenville Treaty, in which, after a series of wars, Native American populations in Ohio agree to cede much of that territory to the United States. And so once again, you see the expansion of American settlement and Native American lands being pushed further and further to the west. This brings us to 1796. George Washington retires from public life. He's replaced by the second president of the United States, who is John Adams. John Adams, who is a Federalist. And the affair that dominates John Adams' presidency is called the XYZ affair. And it's linked to this American insecurity at the time that we see with the Jay Treaty as well. Americans know that they're a new nation, that they can't quite negotiate with Britain and France on as equals, but that they want to be recognized as equals and they want to be seen as independent. And this time it's the French who are taking liberties with American shipping and seizing American ships. And many Americans in response to this want to go to war. And John Adams resists doing this because he knows how dangerous war will be to the country. He knows that the United States isn't ready for another war and a war against France. And this is actually politically pretty courageous because politically it would have been very advantageous for John Adams to go to war. He would be seen as a wartime president, standing up for America. It would have made him very popular. But he knows that this war in the long run would probably be bad for the country. And so he resists going to war. At the same time, he and his administration become so sensitive to criticisms of the government by people who see his refusal to go to war as an act of appeasement to the French, that he's not standing up for the independence that Americans had fought for a generation before, that his administration passes what are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. These highly unpopular acts establish penalties and restrictions on civil liberties for individuals, so restrictions on freedom of speech, and the press, so freedom of the press, people who criticize the administration, people who criticize his decision not to go to war, they can be put in jail or their free speech can be limited. And this is even more unpopular than Adams' decision not to go to war. And it ensures that he will not get reelected. One interesting part of the response to the Alien and Sedition Acts are what are called the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, that Jefferson and Madison, the Republicans who are opposed to the overreach of the federal government's power, encourage the state governments of Kentucky and Virginia to pass. And these Kentucky and Virginia resolutions state that the Alien and Sedition Act is unconstitutional and that these states, Kentucky and Virginia, will not follow federal acts that are unconstitutional. And this kind of reveals the different parties and the different divisions within the United States at this time. That on the one hand, you have the Federalists who are trying to secure their control and their leadership of the government. And to the Republicans, this looks like Federalist overreach. This looks like overreach of the federal government. This looks like an infringement on the liberties that Americans fought for to be free of British rule. And to some people like George Washington, the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions look like they're going too far. Look like the Republicans are going back to the bad days of the Confederation and are weakening the union of the states. So this kind of gives you a sense of the divisions within and the different approaches to the government and the structure of the United States government as we reach 1800. We'll talk more about that next week.